In this video, we're going to talk about why most men don't feel like enough and what they can do about it. So to start off this video, I do want to share a little bit of a quotation here by John Bradshaw, who was a prominent figure in the 80s and 90s and did a lot of work around this idea of shame. And in this quote, he says, "Shame is the root of all addictions. It is the feeling of not being worthy of love, of not being enough." And the reason I bring this up, this idea of not being enough, it's one that I've worked with in my own life. And maybe you've perhaps felt it as well. And essentially, when we break down this feeling of not being enough, that feeling of not being enough, like we're looking at it from an intellectual understanding, not being enough, but what's actually happening inside of the body? Well, when we connect to the emotion of not being enough, this is ultimately the emotion of shame, that in some way who I am at my core is unworthy. Ultimately, it is that the belief that I am unworthy of love. And if we talk about the development of a child does not come into the world with this belief system that in some way I'm fundamentally flawed or in some way I am unworthy of love. No infant comes into the world with those beliefs. They are taught and conditioned those over time. And so essentially what we can look at here is how shame is developed inside of a child. And typically that comes through the link between trauma and shame. There is a link that happens that occurs during a traumatic experience. And when we talk about trauma, it doesn't have to be like what we would call like a big T trauma, huge shocking events like a large, abusive situation or even, sexual abuse or any, large sort of big T trauma. We could also be talking about more subtle little T traumas, little family dynamics, enmeshment, talk about boundary crossings. Every time a child's boundary is crossed, they're taught and conditioned that they're, kind of not good enough, right? That every time that boundary kind of keeps getting pushed back or pushed down by the family system, which is bound to happen at some point, that they're taught that. But it can also occur during those big T traumas as well. There's a really beautiful quote that the body remembers what the mind forgets. And to just understand that quotation, that the body carries a memory, it's picking up sensory data all the time, and especially as children, ages 0 to 10, we were like sponges. We were just constantly picking up information. And so we learned about who we are from the outside world. And so a lot of our internal beliefs about who we are come from early childhood experiences. And so with this, essentially, we have the understanding that somewhere, if we have that feeling of not being good enough, that something happened to us, either overtly, like these big T traumas, or more subvertly, even if we quote unquote came from a good family, which in my opinion doesn't mean that you didn't leave childhood unscathed in some way, that if you have a feeling of unworthiness, that something has happened to you. And ultimately, the process of healing here means getting in touch with these feelings inside of us. Nietzsche talked about shame being the foundation for all of spirituality. So there is a healthy side of shame. Shame is an element of humiliation, helps keep us humble. It helps us to connect with a sense of higher power. It helps us to recognize our limitations in some capacity. But where shame becomes toxic or unhealthy is when limitations are imposed on us that are not supposed to be there. And that is, where limiting beliefs come from. And we can have these top-down approaches of affirmations and, changing our thought patterns, which is, a part of this. However, what we're really working at here is more so of the root cause of the shame, which is the traumatic experience itself. And inside of this shame, ultimately, is our authenticity. That's ultimately what was shamed. And our authenticity is our emotional state, our emotions. And so, if you're a man who also has difficulty expressing emotions, most likely, there's a sense of shame that's tied with that. There's also typically for men a sense of shame associated with sexuality as well. Sexuality is at the core of who we are too. And so if there's an element of shame here, ultimately there's an element that part of you at your core has been shamed, meaning a part of you feels it's unworthy of love. And you play that out internally, whether it's conscious or not. And so ultimately, this process is the process of returning to love, allowing ourselves to give ourselves compassion and acceptance for who we are, and not needing to seek external validation, not needing to be something for somebody else, which as children we were conditioned to do. We had to do that. We had to find acceptance for survival. Gabor Mate, who's an esteemed physician as well, he talks about how a child's need for acceptance is greater than the need for authenticity. So a child will sacrifice who they are in order to please or get acceptance from the family unit because they needed to in order to survive. And so that's really fundamental to understand because that means that at some level it's our survival mechanism turns on to sacrifice who we are in order to gain acceptance. And so ultimately, part of becoming an adult is learning to take care of ourselves so that that part doesn't have to come online as intensely, but when it does, to recognize it so we can say, hey, I got this. We're not in danger here. It's okay to not be accepted. It's okay to be rejected. I can still move forward. This isn't going to kill me, right? Because that childlike part is still inside of the brain. It gets activated and triggered all the way down into the survival mechanisms because not getting accepted as a child would mean death, right? And so as adults, we don't live with that. However, the brain is still responding in that same capacity. So for men, a lot of self-worth typically comes in a couple different areas: money, work, sex, validation, anything, that the external world, the culture has sort of acculturated to have some sort of symbol of worth, right? And so I know for myself, I've been caught several times, chasing validation from sexual partners, chasing validation from financial endeavors, doing what I can to try and fill up a sense inside of myself that in some way I'm worthy, right? And it's almost as if every time, I accomplish something, it might feel good for a little bit, but that sense of worthiness was still there. There was still a hole inside. And ultimately, it was when I started to shift my gaze from looking outward to starting to go inward that I could start developing a little more sense of self-worth, a little more sense of confidence inside of myself. And so ultimately, I share this with you as a way to help you to recognize that there are practical ways that we can start working with shame. I think that one of the most incredible things that we can start doing is to start journaling. There are some journal prompts. I think one of the most incredible journal prompts for this was, when did I first feel that I wasn't enough? And kind of, starting that process of unwinding, like what happened to me? This feeling inside of me, when is the first time that it came online? What was going on around me? Who was around me? Was it family members? Was it friends? Is there a particular memory here that I associate this with? And kind of just dredging up these feelings. And so I think journaling is incredible, but also recognizing that we don't heal in isolation. We heal together in community. So I think that, being around other men who are doing the work and connecting with themselves is an incredible way that you can start working through some of your own stuff. So I really recommend, group therapy. If that's inaccessible to you, there's also plenty of 12-step groups, even if you don't identify as, having a particular addiction. ACA, which is Adult Children of Dysfunctional Families, is an incredible place you can start working with and unwinding some of this stuff. So there's plenty of accessibility. And then, of course, working one-on-one with a therapist like myself, you can start working on, in a safe container, just unraveling shame. And a lot of shame has to do with hiding in secrecy. Shame is ultimately hiding a part of oneself. There's a lot of the shadow that is involved with shame, these parts of ourselves that we disconnected from who we are, but these parts of ourselves are also where the juice of us is, the inner child, the emotional exuberance, being able to connect to feelings, sadness, grief, anger, and joy as well. All these emotions get pushed down due to shame. Shame's kind of like a constricting force inside. And so when we ultimately are talking about healing from shame, we're talking about feeling shame and allowing it to be here and to not run away from it. Personally, I feel shame. I can feel it in my stomach, kind of in my solar plexus is sort of where it lives for me. And, some of the work that I've done in retreat settings, as well as group therapy and, various groups, I've started to unravel and work with some of that and to identify when I have feelings and thoughts that surround shame, that I can, identify and do a top-down approach, which is ultimately telling myself affirmations that I am worthy of love, that I'm lovable, comforting myself, which is a top-down approach, and then also bottom-up approaches, meaning, doing some of that deeper trauma work as well, going to a trauma healing retreat, maybe doing somatic breath work, finding a psychodrama retreat. So these are all ways that you can start connecting with with the body and with parts of yourself. And if you're currently looking for somebody who knows how to, navigate these realms, or just looking for somebody to talk to about this, I am currently taking on clients. So if you would like to, you can schedule a free consultation by clicking the link down below. And then if you wouldn't also mind liking and subscribing and help these videos to get into YouTube's algorithm, I really appreciate you, watching this video. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. And I hope you have a great rest of your day. Take care.